First of all, I'd like to thank Jim and John for hosting this conference and inviting us. A very impressive speaker list and author list, might we say. And what we're going to do for this session, we're going to have Gerry here, and we're going to have Hana, and we're going to take questions from anybody who has a question. And I'm going to come down with this and take your question, and then these guys will answer. So, who's got a question?
What is your name?
Oh, sorry. What's my name? I'm Pete Griffiths. I came here from Ireland. Yeah, I don't want to say too much about myself. I'm an ex-Scientologist. I believe that speaking out about Scientology, as Gerry says, telling the truth about Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard is probably one of the greatest things we can do in helping others avoid the pitfalls that we may have fallen into. So that's who I am. That's why I'm here. I feel it's a very worthwhile thing to do, and that's why I do it. That's why I'm here. So, who's got a question for Gerry or Hana? Right, here we go. Is this going to work?
Let's get the paying guests first.
Who's the paying guests? Okay. So.
Yes, I was wondering if you can tell us about the sexuality of L. Ron Hubbard throughout his life, whether it was consistent, whether it changed on the boat before, etc. Thank you.
Great question. Who wants to take that one?
You want to take that on? Do you?
We probably both don't know a great deal about it. I never had an affair with him. But I did have possession of his archive, so I know something of his history. I know that it was a great concern of him as evidenced by his admissions, his affirmations. Earlier today I referred you to those, and I think a great deal of insight can be derived from reading those, because he does talk about his sexual hang-ups, and this is when he was, I guess, 32, 34, something like that, years old. So I think he was probably normal in a lot of ways. He came from an era when I think relative kinkiness was probably more rare than it is today. I think that he talked about his masturbation history in the affirmations, so he was hung up on that, and he talked about the message that he had gotten from his mother about it and the dangers of it, and from doctors the dangers of it. And so as an adult, he was also talking about it and concerned about it. He got married fairly early, and his first wife was some years older than he was, so he was probably quite sexually mature, and he had a number of affairs through his history. And he had actually a relationship with Robert Heinlein's wife, and writes about that in the affirmations, the admissions. And then, of course, he was married 3 times. He fathered, I guess, 7 children. And then I think toward the end of his life, he was not, I believe, sexual, although for the years on the ship, I mentioned this earlier, he surrounded himself with very young teenage girls who he decked out in hot pants and halter tops. So there was definitely a sexual aura about that, and he probably obtained some pleasure from having them around, just, having them serve him and dress him, which, nowadays I think is fairly kinky.
Yeah.
And,
Did you have
and
any-
would
Sorry.
actually be probably considered a form of child abuse.
Absolutely, yeah. Hannah, at the time, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I did. To add to what Gerry has said, I knew him in the early days of the Sea Organization, and one period in Las Palmas when we were refitting the Avon River, which later became known as the Athena. Peggy Bankston, one of the very early Sea Project members, came up to me one night. No, this is after it became the Sea Org. We were already on the mission into time when Hubbard traveled around the Mediterranean trying to find all his treasure. Peggy came up to me one day and she was radiant. She was acting as Hubbard's flag banking officer. She handled all the invoices, receipts, his money, and kept track of everything. She came up to me one night on the ship and she said, her face just aglow, she said, if you look at Hubbard's cabin tonight, at the porthole leading into the bathroom, it was frosted, the porthole was frosted glass, but you could see the light come on and off in it. She said, go up there and watch that light, and you'll see it come on and go off twice. Two people showering. She said, we're having an affair, and it's the most incredible thing I've ever experienced. Well, I was pretty startled by that. I didn't think Hubbard had a mind for that at all. And I didn't go on deck and watch. I felt like that would be so intrusive that that was not my thing. But shortly after that, maybe 2 months later, Peggy fell in bad with LRH. I had to audit her through several sessions. LRH then found that she was suppressive and she was declared and sent off the ship. And she died several years later from cancer.
Wow.
That's all I know about his sexuality, except to verify what Gerry said. He loved having those little messengers around. He would go out on his daily walks on the decks, and always had two messengers with him, one holding his ashtray, and the other holding a pack of his menthol cools.
Yeah, non-filtered.
Non-filter, thank you. Non-filter menthol cools, and as she would light it for him, she would offer him one and light it for him, and then he would tap his cigarette into the other ashtray that was offered. Cigarette after cigarette after cigarette. There were many times when Hubbard had all his aides trailing after him on the deck, and he would go into some sort of discourse or another, or we'd watch the overboards being done, and he had those two little girls there with the ashtray and the cigarettes. I think he got a big kick out of it. I'm not exactly sure what kind of kick, but he liked that. Although he justified it, I thought it was a justification. When he was assembling the CMO, he told the aides, of which I was one at the time, that young people have to be put to work. They long to be put to work. They long to have a job, which they can learn to do well. And it seemed like he was being a good guy at that point. But I think there was some ulterior motive to it, but I don't know what.
Thank you. That was a great question. Sir?
Thanks for summing up that stuff so well.
On the heels of that question, then, I had something I was always wondering about. I've never been able to ask anybody who was actually on the ship about this. 2D rules as an issue comes out at the FO, the flag order, right? Prior to that, there was a policy letter called Second Dynamic Rules, which specifically stated we're not getting involved in that area, it has nothing to do with anything, and it's not our job to try to regulate sexuality or sexual activity, and it always just results in problems if we do. But then in the Sea Org, this flag order comes out saying, no sex before marriage, no heavy petting, no this, that, right? And it really was one of those like kind of come down hard issues, kind of like the LSD thing, like the thou shalt not ever, and this isn't petitionable, and it's clearly written in a sort of mode, right? What prompted that to occur? I've always wondered, and I've kind of, these rumors about wild activities and all this, but what was it like before, and why do you think that issue got written? Because it certainly has affected the entire culture of the Sea Org.
You want to follow? Okay.
Another great question there. Very quickly before you answer that,
Yes.
for those who are not familiar with that terminology, second dynamic, caught you. The dynamics, it's a principle in Scientology where each of the dynamics is an urge towards survival. The second dynamic is you urging yourself towards survival through sexual activity, and I think children too.
Yes, and children.
That would just explain that for those who needed it. I also heard about parties on the ship. Was any of that true?
Oh, that's part of it. When you get a bunch of young people together who are idealistic, who want to save the world, who are pumped up with great emotions, what's going to happen? It's like Woodstock. It's like any other big event, with young people, and particularly as we weren't that well supervised. Hubbard was doing his thing, and everybody was doing his thing in his own area, and very focused on doing it as well as possible so they didn't incur the wrath of Hubbard. And so these sexual escapades would spontaneously occur from, one period early in one year to the end of the year. Maybe they would occur again, and then the following year, maybe in June or July, they would occur again. And this particular one, I'm not sure. Gerry, do you know what occurred on the ship that brought Hubbard down so hard at that time? I think it was just one of those joyous, liberative moments, amongst the ship's crew.
Yeah, so Scientology was advertised that way, as you state, originally. And of course, that's attractive for recruiting, right? There's no morals. We're talking ethics. We're not interested in your morals, and we're not interested in you as a body. So that's sort of the philosophy which was attractive to the flower children like myself and etc. However, sexual matters are big news. So that's one of the things that happened as well, was some of the publications that were coming out about, was it a sex ship? Were sex slaves? Were there this? I think there's even one of the early videos or films that was done.
I think so, yes.
Focused on that.
Yes.
And so I think that he just went, stop it, so that we can show, as Scientology does today, they say, here are our rules. Aren't we so wonderful and Puritan? While indeed, actually, abuse, child abuse, sexual things are going on. And of course, there were two different standards. So there's a different standard for the people at the top of the organization as there are now. Like when Jesse was talking about the people at the top of the organization all drinking scotch and getting high on booze. That would have been taboo for anyone lower in the organization, but at the top, it's fine.
It's fine, yes. And the reason why it became an issue is because throughout those early days, crew members were leaving, Sea Org members were leaving. Some big explosion would occur on the ship. I'm not talking about a physical, emotional, some issue would come up, and a few people would either be the cause of the issue and be sent off the ship, or they would just blow, they would leave. And so parents ashore began to get from their kids a glimpse of the debauchery that was going on the ship from time to time, and that got into the newspapers, and that's how it started. Yeah, and they were, mostly the stories and papers were blown out of all proportion, but there was truth to it.
Was there that whole thing as well, when people did leave the ship, did they suddenly become, no one spoke about them and the reasons why, or was that discussed openly? You know how if a staff member blew, all of a sudden they were never mentioned ever again, or they had huge overts or something?
Right. Well, mostly they weren't much talked about because everybody on the ship was busy from dawn to dusk and past midnight trying to keep their own area intact
So you
and
never
their
had
own
time.
statistics
You never
up.
had time to wonder about other
No,
people.
and,
right.
and discuss things like that. Yeah.
Also, someone like John McLean, who was here,
Yeah.
who left the ship, handling him would have been turned over to the Guardian's office. So staff would not have a clue about the operations that were being run against a disaffected Sea Org member.
To keep him quiet, to keep his family from knowing, and much more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Alexander?
Yeah, Alexander.
I have a shorter question about different period of Hubbard's life, earlier period. And well, there are a few people here that knew Hubbard. So could you tell me, did he speak any foreign languages?
No, not at all. Only English and, of course, American English.
Yeah, and then, well, it makes the second question: how in the world was he able to talk to those llamas in China?
Thank you. Are you going to answer that one?
Go ahead, Gerry.
Hubbard claims that we have done everything in our past, and therefore we can do everything in the present. And that was how we were indoctrinated to accept any position on the ship or in the sea organization. So he, of course, knew all of his past when, you remember, he was Buddha. So although he spoke a different dialect at that point, he was able, he was able to converse with the llamas.
Who was it as well who was sent ashore in Portugal to buy stuff, and when they said they didn't know Portuguese, they were just told to handle it? Who was
Yes.
that?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we learned a few words here and there. Obrigado is one. Thank you. I forget many others I knew, but we picked up words fairly quickly, but not Hubbard.
Okay.
Yes, in fact, speaking of Portuguese,
Yeah.
I had the job, I was ashore a great deal, and I mentioned that I dealt with immigration and customs and that sort of thing. So I likewise picked up a few words of Portuguese, and I was his translator. So when his tailor came on board for a fitting, I translated as well as I could. So, I learned how to say like more in the shoulder or something like that. Or also his barber came on board during that time. So, clip a little more around the ears or some phrase in Portuguese. So I'd, study a few words. But no, I don't think he was competent in any other language at all.
No.
Thank you. Do we have a question? Oh, right at the back.
There's Steve back there.
I asked Hannah this earlier, but I think I'd love us all to hear from both of them. Do you both, how would you both describe Hubbard in terms of recognizing almost every human is complex? A black circle is just a black circle, if you get my point. Whereas a mosaic is different, and I tend to think Hubbard's a mosaic, but you could be 99% or 90% something negative and 10% positive. So sort of like when I went on my first date with my wife, we went skating, And she said, for a fat guy, you don't sweat much. You're supposed to laugh, folks. We went to a library on our first date, and I was thin. Okay, so what's your view of Hubbard, looking back, knowing everything you know?
Want to go first, Jeff?
Oh, Jesse wanted to ask that as well.
Okay, guys, who wants to answer that?
Okay, I'll start off. My first impression of Hubbard when I saw his picture in the Johannesburg hallway to the executive offices, it was a huge picture on the wall. And the hallway was dark, but I noticed it as I was going down the hallway, and I stopped to look at it, and a staffer came by and switched on the light. And as it happened, when I was 14 years old in South Africa, my mother had shown me a passage out of Madame Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine that said in 1950, a man with red hair, an American, would start a new movement in America which would eventually benefit mankind, benefit the world, something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And I'd kept this all along as I'd love to meet these people. I want to meet this group. I want to get to America and meet this group. So when the light came on in the hallway, and there he was in all his glory, and that shock of red hair leapt out of the picture at me, I was absolutely convinced he was the man that she had prophesied would start his own movement in 1950. And of course, DMSMH was written in 1950, and I'd read that already. So I thought he was God Almighty himself. That was my first impression. When I got to St. Hill and saw him lecture and saw the weird things he did on stage, I was very doubtful. And I just had to take that doubt aside and shove it away, because I knew, according to Dianetics, it was coming from my reactive mind, and eventually I'd get rid of it. So all the doubts that I was getting, I was automatically, according to DMSMH, filing them away, pushing them aside, rationalizing. They're coming from my reactive mind. Later on the ship, I saw him in moments of such rage that it shocked me, as I'm sure it shocked other people. For example, when we were outfitting and renovating the Avon River in Las Palmas, one day the Spanish painters were painting the outside hull with that anti-rust coat, the red coat. And he had already appointed me as the MAA to watch out for anybody who was creating a disturbance or making mistakes on board, and I thought everything was going fine. He appeared on the beach through the gate from the street and started bellowing. Now, this was you weren't there. I keep forgetting you weren't there at the time. And it was about 200 feet, I'd say, from where the ship was to where the beach started. He started bellowing as soon as he came through that gate and came lumbering down, heavy man, lumbering down across the sand, screaming at the top of his lungs. Somehow, and this shows the contradiction of the man, somehow he had seen that the painters were using bad paintbrushes and leaving the strips of cotton in the paint on the side of the ship. And that, of course, would make the paint, it would spoil the paintwork. The seawater would get in through those little holes, and it just nullified the entire job. He saw it when he came through that gate. I don't know, at that time I didn't know about his vision, his injured optic nerves and his blindness and so on. But at that time, that caught me again, even though the rage surprised me. I fell in love with the man all over again because he could see that far, that well, and catch a job that was being done badly that all of us had missed. And then later on, the outbursts occurred gradually, more and more frequently. And finally, I had nothing, because I had gotten rid of my reactive mind, I had no more excuse. But then, unfortunately, OT3 came out. Now it was the reactive mind of the BTs that I was experiencing. So again, I had an excuse as to where to assign my doubts. It's just, anyway, Hubbard, the outbursts, the rages just got gradually worse and worse. And there were times when I was in my office on A deck that I would hear him below in his cabin, screaming and hollering, and it sounded like he was throwing things against the bulkhead, like dishes maybe, because suddenly a crash would occur, like things were tinkling and falling down the sides of the steel bulkhead. I never had that verified, but those were the types of rages he would get, and sometimes even in his research room, his office on A deck. Gerry, you must have known some of those.
Oh, yes.
Witnessed some of them.
Yes, I was the target of a
number of them.
In my view, I think the thing that would be the most insulting thing to him, but I think very true, is that he was actually just like us. He was an ordinary, more ordinary than he could ever admit to. He called himself, I'm just a man, but he said it in a context in which he really meant that he was something far beyond a man.
Right.
He wrote that we won't speculate on why I rose above the bank. In other words, he was somehow superhuman, whereas we all had subconscious minds, and somehow he was greater. In his OT8 material, this is where he actually essentially declares that he is Lucifer, or the Antichrist. And so he takes unto himself superhuman powers. He becomes, in his mind, the bringer of light. He embraces anti-Christianity. He embraces being Lucifer. But I think psychologically, he was two things, I think, which directly relate to each other. And one of them was, as he was declared in the judgment in the first case in which Scientology sued me, he was declared a pathological liar. And I believe that is key to understanding him, and certainly we saw this morning all kinds of instances of his lying pathologically, lying when he really didn't even need to lie. And the other aspect of it is his sadism, because a sadist, and I take this from Eric Fromm, whose studies on the subject I greatly appreciate. A sadist is someone who has a desire to control others, absolute control. And that's what he sought, and that's what we gave him. So he had underneath him everyone. He only had people around that he could control, and if control was slipping in the least, then he aggressed against that person without limit. And then he said, the only way that you can control someone is by lying to them. So the two things tie in together. He knew that he was a liar, even though he wrote toward the end of his life in a bulletin, he wrote two Scientologists, I have never lied to you and I've never conned you.
Yes, yes. Yes.
And that was during the time when he was being exposed in court as a pathological liar. So those two things go together, sadism and pathological lying. I would say also that there was megalomania,
Yes,
and
definitely.
there was psychopathy,
Yes.
and this gentleman here this morning, yes, he had, I think, some great insights into Hubbard neurologically and how that manifested in various behaviors. And so the way he spoke, the way he wrote, he got into automatic writing. He was extremely prolific, and he was a control freak. He was aggressive. He had these angry outbursts. And there's a litany of behaviors that relate to this particular condition. Maybe you could say what that condition was.
Well, it's the Geschwind syndrome.
Yes.
You might need this.
Epileptic, yeah. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, the Geschwind syndrome, which is developed by certain temporal lobe epileptics. It is associated with hyperreligiosity and with about 17 types of personality traits. If you want, I can read them out, but
Sure.
And they fit him. They fit
and they fit him
Hubbard.
pretty well.
Yeah.
Let me find. So these are in some non-particular order. Emotionality. The next one is elation or euphoria, and then sadness.
Yes.
The next one is anger and aggression. Altered sexual interest, which includes loss of libido, sometimes. Guilt, which I think is the one that least fits him.
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
When you look at how he ran away from England onto the ships into international waters, he was guilty for what he had done and ashamed of it on the beach, and also fearful of the consequences.
Okay.
So I think there was
So-
definitely guilt and shame built in that manifested from time to time only, but not for us to see. It was something that he experienced himself.
Okay.
Anyway,
so
that's what I
even
think.
that. The next one is hypermoralism, which includes described here as attention to rules with inability to distinguish significant minor infractions and desire to punish offenders. The next one is obsessionalism,
Yes,
and
definitely.
that is described as
Yes.
ritualism, orderliness, compulsive attention to detail.
Yes.
Following is circumstantiality, which is described here as loquacious, pedantic, overly detailed, and peripheral.
Yes.
Yeah.
Following is viscosity, described as stickiness or tendency to repetition.
Yes.
Yeah. The next one is sense of personal destiny.
Yes. Very
course.
much so. All right.
Hypergraphia, of course, which
That's writing a great deal.
writing a great deal, extensive diaries, detailed notes, writing autobiography or novel. And then next is religiosity,
Yes.
Yeah.
and next is philosophic interest.
Yes.
Following is dependence or passivity.
Yes.
And next is humorlessness and sobriety. Yeah. And the last one is paranoia.
Yes,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah, it's a good.
So,
Thank
Doc-
you. Can we just take one more question for you guys? Do you mind?
So Dr. Beverly, I think, does all of this,
Yeah, that's very mosaic-like.
Isn't it?
Good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Steve's going to ask the last question, and then we go to Nancy and Jesse.
Hi. Hana, I remember you telling me that you suffered migraines and you had a lot of pain and suffering for a long period of time. And I wondered if you could just share whatever you're comfortable about about how much pressure you were under, how much physical pain you were experiencing, and also just the phobia programming against doctors and mental health professionals and all of that, or anything that you would like to say. It's probably too much for our
Right.
last question, but.
Right, yeah, thanks for the question, Steve. I got into the C project in 1966, I guess. 1966, and became the C organization. I was doing great. I felt wonderful. I was clear, number 60, and that though I recognize it as an altered state of consciousness, it was the clearest, most brilliant, perceptive, enlightened state Fortunately, I've had a number of them afterwards in my life, but that was absolutely brilliant. It stayed with me for about 4 months, totally calm, totally present all the time. And I knew, this is clear, this is exactly what Hubbard meant. When I got to the ship, the Avon River in Las Palmas, we were so busy, I didn't have much time to think about case. You know, how far I had gotten, what was coming next, and so on. I was in the middle of OT2, which had gone very well for me, and I declared that one complete on the ship. And then beginning of 1968, round about March 68, OT3 was released. And that was when everything went wrong with me. I was staggered by the content of the material. I could not believe that here we were, people who were doing exceptionally well, who could take orders and almost instantly, you know, follow through on them, get things done, that we were now subject to these hundreds of thousands of dead souls that were stuck all over us and inside us, and they were what was now wrong with us. It was their reactive minds that was now causing us to have our own fears and everything. And it wasn't real to me because that was not the case with me. I tried auditing the material. I could not do it. Finally, I faked, you know, a few sessions and pretended and found maybe a little read here and there. And that was just me. Some people were able to run it fine and get gain from it. I was just one of those who couldn't. And after a week, I went and declared the state complete, but I was already getting the start of those headaches were coming and going through the day. I didn't know it was due to the auditing on OT3. About 5 days after we had declared, Yvonne, myself, Peggy Bankston was still there at the time. Hubbard called Yvonne Gillum. Hubbard called the three of us into his research, into his office. We were on the Royal Scotland at that time in Southampton, and he called us in there and he read us the Riot Act. And he was steaming, he was growling, he was thundering, he was shouting. And he said, if you think you're going to get away with auditing OT3 for 1 week, when it took me years to bring into any state where people could use it, and I almost died doing it, you are wrong. And he went on and on about this. And I am going to tell you something now that may change your life, it may not. He said, you are all going to go back to OT3 and audit it. And if you cannot do it, you are going to be declared suppressive. And you are going to be expelled. We didn't have the word expel in those days. You're going to be put off the ship. He said, and here is what I'm going to tell you about the rest of the story that you don't know. He said, and when Xenu blew up everyone, he said, there were fires around the planet for months. And voices came out of the fires, and they were pleading, help me, help me, help me, crying around the world to attract all the individual souls who had not yet been caught, so that they could be picked up and taken off to the Hawaiian island or to Las Palmas for implantation and packaging. And he went on and on with this, you know, and the volcanoes kept exploding for months, killing off people. And the amount of people who were brought from other planets here were in the millions. They just kept, those DC-8s just kept bringing people over. And he really ramped up the story to a point where I was like dazed with the story. And at the end of it, he said, and if any of you have anything wrong with you tomorrow, anything, the flu, an illness, a cold, or whatever, I'll know that you lied in your attestation, and that's it for you. And he dismissed us, he walked off. Well, next morning, I had this tiny, tiny tickle at the back of my throat, and I thought, damn it, he's not going to win this one. And I was already on my job on the Avon River. We were preparing to go onto mission into time, and he came. I was the chief officer organizing things being loaded in the hold and all sorts of things. He came marching on deck that morning in full uniform, with all his aides in full uniform. I thought, oh shit, you know, here it comes. I knew what was going to happen, and he came right up to me. I mean, his face was this close to mine, and he said, "And how are you this morning?" And I just stood there for quite a moment, saluted him, and I said, "Sir, I'm 100% okay, sir. Sir." And he relaxed at that moment. You know, that whole facade dropped away, and he just shook his head and became himself again, and looked around the deck, and he said, "You've got everything under the control. Well done. Well done. Carry on, everyone." And he left the ship. And Steve, I don't know if I answered. Did I answer your question? I tend to get distracted into other things.
There's time to talk tomorrow, I guess. It was really about the migraines and the fear
Oh, the
of getting
migraines.
help from mental health professionals.
Yes, the migraines started at that point. And just the twinges of headaches. And as I had to go back to audit more OT3, they just, over the next 6 months, gradually set in until I had a headache all day and all night. It never quit. And for the next, from 1968 to 1982, when I left, I had a headache. And sometimes they were so bad I couldn't work. And other times they were just a throbbing in the background with the pain. And because of that, I got even more auditing. And sometimes Hubbard would see as my case supervise my folders and make sure the auditing was being done correctly. It was just, auditing got to be an absolute torture. And once I left the Sea Org, we never went for any help. You know, I went to doctors and they diagnosed all sorts of amazing things that never turned out to be the cause of anything. Had x-rays, CAT scans, MRIs, whatever, nothing, fortunately. And 6 months after I left the Sea Org, it started to miraculously clear up, you know. They disappeared. As I recovered, they disappeared. And it was just that...
Is that fairly common? Yeah. Is that fairly common amongst ex-members, though, the headache thing? Because I had that when I was in, and the headaches themselves would cripple you. I mean,
Yes.
you could not move.
Yes.
You just had to lie there in a darkened room, and that was it.
Yes.
After Scientology, they were cured.
Yes.
So, I want to thank Gerry and Hana for taking the questions.
I left October 31st, Halloween of 1992. I've been in there. I had left before me and my wife did the escape thing, you know, where you just blow, or how they call it, blow, disappear. And then they found us and threatened us and on, and we came back, and I actually had to leave on their terms, which means, you know, you route out, you go through the routing form, and you allow them to do any and everything they possibly can do to change your mind. and to keep you there. And this went on for months. And finally, there were many times where I just walked out and said, you get Miscavige's ass down here right now, or I'm walking out of here and going to the LA Times. And that always brought about something to get me out of there just a little bit quicker. I was never, one thing about my relationship with Scientology, I got into Scientology because I thought L. Ron knew something. I thought that he had something that other people didn't have. I thought I could learn from him. I never thought that about Miscavige. I knew he was an idiot. And when when L. Ron passed, the one thing Miscavige wanted me to do is take a knee and serve him. I didn't do it. I pulled a gun on him. Others served him, and things got worse and worse and worse and worse in the Sea Org, because no one ever stood up and did something to him or threatened him in a way that showed they didn't appreciate his what he was doing. Things progressively just kept getting worse and worse and worse. It seems like, and I'm not trying to toot my horn, but I was like the only person that he feared. When I left, he was nowhere around. He was afraid to come around me because he thought I was going to take that opportunity to do something really bad to him physically. So I would be here and he would be way over there. And when I finally left, Marty was my handler, Marty Rathbun. And some of us have here and abroad have had to learn to like him and appreciate him because of the things that he did while he was there. And I'm one of those persons. But he was the person that had me and controlling. And I always already kicked his butt. So it was like, he's nothing to me either. I talk about being a violent and fighting person. I was trained in black belt in karate. I learned that in Scientology. I was a little larger than I am now. I was 5'11", 5'11" and a half, almost 6 feet tall. Because of my illness, I've lost inches off my height and stuff like that. But there was a point in time where I guess I was a threat. And so when I left, I did whatever they wanted me to do. But when I left the subject. I wasn't still a Scientologist. I wasn't still thinking Scientology and Hubbard were wonderful and they knew something, or it had just gone bad because of Miscavige. No, I was done with the subject completely. I stopped auditing myself. I stopped auditing other people. I stopped studying that shit. And I actually started praying to get my mind back. I worked on recovery while I was still there. And when I walked out the door, it was over. So that's that.
Take a question from Steve.
So what you were just saying, Jesse, I'd love for you to expand it. I'd love to hear from Nancy too about the notion that people have expressed that, well, you know, Miscavige was a bad person, but the tech is still good, and I'm going to work on auditing and going up the bridge and as free zones or whatever. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you, Steve. I'm getting plenty of exercise. There you go.
I just want to answer that. For me, what Gerry Armstrong did in terms of getting all these affirmations out was very, very, very healing. Because when I read in those affirmations, because I myself am spiritual and I believe in prayer and I believe in, meditation getting yourself centered. So I was familiar with the practice of affirmations, which is current in a lot of philosophies. When you do affirmations, for them to work, it's from your heart. It's got to be from your center, from your soul. And when I read the affirmation of all, I think it's all men are my willing slaves.
Men are my slaves, elemental spirits are my slaves.
Yep. And I went, that was us in the Sea Org. We were his willing slaves. He manifested what he had affirmed. And I was one of those idiots that became his slave. And then I took it one step further. What's in his heart? How can a person even, I couldn't even think with how a person could want that. What kind of heart does L. Ron Hubbard have? That this was his desire. That's what you do in affirmations. You put out your heart's desire. And he had a heart's desire for slaves. And that about ends it with me with him.
You know, for me, it was a little different. People, all the great work that people like Gerry Armstrong did and other people, what he exposed, I truly had to learn about that after I got out. Because, of course, when you're in the bubble, you're deprived of all information, even TV. So I had to actively work on discovering, you know, other people. But again, for me, that was just almost a hobby because I was done with the subject. I didn't need more convincing. I already knew that, well, first off, I did every OT level in Scientology, old and new. Back before, you know, Hubbard came out with the knots and blah, blah, blah and all that, I did all that 0 to 7, all them OT levels. Back in, when was it, about 81, I had done everything L. Ron had ever written. I was a quick study. I wasn't like a stupid person, and not to say that other people are, but I was pretty quick study, and I was good. I could do what I learned. So by 1981, probably in 1980, I had done everything processing-wise L. Ron had to offer. And it just by chance, when I finished that old OT7, oh, here comes knots. So while I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, here's something new, because nothing happened on those other OT levels for sure. I mean, you know, a little thing happened. I was talking with Hana about OT2, you know, where I got hot and sweating and shit and sleepy and, you know, all kind of craziness is going on and I can't explain. So I figured something's working. OT3, forget about it. You know, I didn't have any of that, none of that. So L. Ron came out with Ned for OTs, and I hadn't done that. Well, how strange is it that I then become the supervisor for this new Ned for OTs? When it came out, within months, I was at Flag training people to do it. I trained Jerry's wife, current wife, to do it. She was one of my students. Another person, Bruce Hines was one of my students in the knots course. I mean, pretty much anyone that had studied that new Ned for OTs, I trained them as a course supervisor. Then I was their intern supervisor, which means interning them through it. And then after that, I was their quality control person, their cramming officer. So I worked with these people for years, taking them from where they were to getting them through this whole new ideology of, and as I was doing that, that's when I got called to go to Golden Era in '82. So I did those OT levels too. And guess what? I still couldn't make a feather blow across the room unless I went, I still could do nothing more than I could do before I cracked any of those things. And I was, and you know, for me, it's like this, you know, prior to Scientology, I was already having out-of-body experiences. I already knew I was a spirit. I already knew that there was the seen and the unseen. I wanted to know what the unseen was. So And also being a Catholic, going to confession, you know, all the crap that a lot of the stuff that they do in Scientology is repeated in, you know, is also Christianity. I guess L. Ron borrowed quite a bit from that. So in the end, I was the same person. I've done 2 sets of OT levels, all this training, trained all of these other people. And guess what? I'm still me. I thought, I'm done with this shit. This is just silly. Because, as I said, I was already having spontaneous out-of-body, I don't know why. Lawrence Wright even mentions it in his book because I spoke to him about it. I don't know why that was, but I had certainty that there was more to this life than just being a human. There was another aspect to being human that interested me. And Scientology, I will be honest, I did learn some things about that from L. Ron. Whether he stole it from someone or whatever, but it did clarify some things for me. But what I learned in Scientology, if I take everything that I learned in Scientology and pair it with $7, I know damn well I can buy a nice slice of pizza. When I left the place, I found out you really just need $7. And that's that.
Thanks. Thank you. We're down to our last couple of minutes. Is there a quick question burning in anyone's soul, heart, inner core? Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Nancy.